Hi, this is Joe Montana.
This is Dak Prescott.
Hey, this is Jason Kelsey, and you're listening to Rob Maaddi.
Rob Maaddi.
Rob Maaddi.
I am Rob Maaddi, and welcome to the AP Pro Football Podcast. We've reached the midpoint of the NFL season. Every team has played at least 8 games. Some have played 9. The NFC is wide open at this point. The Saints, Packers, Seahawks are the top 3 teams. I'm not writing off the Buccaneers just yet. The Rams, the Cardinals are in the mix. The Steelers survived a close one against Dallas. They stayed unbeaten. They're just ahead of the Chiefs, so it's a 2-team race, I believe, for the top spot in the AFC. We'll talk about that and more with former NFL linebacker Emmanuel Acho. AP Pro Football writer Barry Wilner joins me to examine some big NFL news this week, plus look ahead to Week 10. And Tim Booth, who does a great job covering the Seahawks for AP, will break the team down. We'll kick off this week with my colleague, Barry Wilner, AP Pro Football writer and Pro Football Hall of Fame voter. Barry, the NFL's making contingency plans in case every team can't play the full 16-game schedule. So they're going to expand the playoffs from 14 to 16 if only if meaningful games are canceled due to COVID-19. So, of course, they don't want to have to get to that point, but the virus is going to have final say. Do you think, though, it's fair to expand if necessary? Because if they do expand from 14 to 16, the 2 teams that would have had a bye in a 16-team format, they don't get a bye.
Yeah, I understand that, but the word fair really can't be used too much with this season because of COVID-19. Mm-hmm. So they're just adjusting because they do not want to have to deal with a situation where a team plays 14 games, another plays 16, how do you decide who goes to the playoffs? This is really a last resort type of thing, though, Rob, because they do have a week or even 2 weeks they could use in January where they could extend the season as need be to finish it off. Again, would that be fair if some teams are playing, the second weekend in January to finish off the regular season before the playoffs begin the next week? Maybe not, but that's just what 2020 is like.
Yeah, and the one thing they did amend is originally, if they were going to expand from 14 to 16, they were going to reseed, which means it doesn't matter if you win a division. In the case of the NFC East, you wouldn't get that home field. But eventually, they changed their mind on the floor. So Philadelphia Eagles or whoever ends up winning the NFC East will still get a first-round home game if they win that division. Do you have any problem with that?
No, and I think TV was involved there. I think TV wants to kind of know where some of these games are going to be a little bit ahead of time, at least what, divisions and stuff. So I think that was probably an important step in TV's eyes.
That makes a lot of sense. Also, the league this week approved rewarding teams for developing minority coaches and GMs, front office, personnel bosses. When this idea first came up, they were going to reward the teams who did the hiring. I like this plan better. It encourages the teams to hire and develop the candidates, and they would eventually get compensation picks in the 3rd round. Why do you think the league changed it up? Was there too much pushback against the original plan?
I think part of it is that it would have looked like the teams doing the hiring maybe were doing the hiring only to get draft picks, or it would be a major reason, and that's not a good look. And to reward teams for developing minority coaches, and we may be talking about women coaches as we move along too. I think that's a valid step. The NFL has been tinkering with the Rooney Rule for years and will continue to do so. But you know what, Rob? It's still the same owners. It's still the same kind of process. And until they slow down the process, as Tony Dungy always says, and are more getting more information and more thorough, I'm not sure how much this is going to help.
Barry, we're midway through the season. Road teams have a winning record so far, and that's the first time that it's happened through 9 weeks since 1983. How much do you attribute that to lack of fans in the stadium?
In some cities, I think that's true. There are certain cities where it makes a big difference. Now, obviously, it hasn't mattered in Pittsburgh. They haven't lost anybody. But there are cities where the crowd does make a difference. It can be intimidating. You look at Seattle. You look at, although Seattle hasn't done too badly at home, You look at New England, which has really struggled at home. Those are just two. New Orleans is another team that hasn't had that big advantage because the fans aren't there. So I think it is a factor. I don't think it's the only factor. And I also, last year, road teams did pretty well. They weren't above 500, obviously, but they did okay. And I think that may change a little bit when the weather becomes more of a factor. But having said that, remember, Las Vegas went into Cleveland and played on what was basically a wintry day, and Las Vegas won.
I want to get to the Raiders in a few seconds, but before we do, let's get to some of the bigger surprises last week. First one was the Saints absolutely annihilated, dismantled the Buccaneers in Tampa. They beat them week 1, which was understandable, Brady's first game. This time, they beat them 38-3 in Tampa, worst loss in Brady's career. New Orleans took control of the South. It might not be so bad, Barry, for Tampa to finish second, because in that case, they get the 5 seed, and they face the NFC East team in the first round instead of winning the division and matching up against one of the really good teams out west. Did that loss, though, expose the Buccaneers to you, or do you still see them as a viable contender for that 1 seed, which they're still in the mix for?
I think they're a viable contender to win that division. The 1 seed, I'm not so sure. I think Green Bay probably has the easiest path to that right now because its division is pretty weak. But I would also say that, to think the Bucs are in great shape for number 4 seed when you've got the Rams in Seattle and even Arizona with a shot at that too, that may be thinking a little too far ahead.
Yeah, the 5 isn't an automatic for them. You're right if they lose out.
But, talking about that game, there were 2 things that really disturbed me about that game. Number one was Tampa's defense had been playing so well and was beginning to look like the best defense in the league. And 2 games in a row against the Giants and then against the Saints, they didn't show up for much of it. So that was disturbing. And then the other thing was you could see how frustrated Brady was. And I know that Arians kind of silently or quietly blamed Brady for some of the problems. But Brady looked down on himself in that game, and you almost never see that. I expect him to have a huge game this week against Carolina.
I don't understand what the heck he was doing out there, down 38-3, 5, 6, 7 minutes left in the fourth quarter, taking hits too, unless it's just that it's his decision. And Bruce Arians, Arians, when asked about it, said, well, he's the quarterback and we're trying to lose points. But it doesn't make sense to have a 43-year-old quarterback out there taking shots, absorbing hits, unless it's Tom Brady's decision. What do you think?
I think that Arians needs to tread a little lightly on that because I do think Brady probably has some input in that. And the funny thing is you mentioned that Mahomes got to sit somewhat this last week against the Jets, and then obviously Breeze got to sit some in his game. We've seen Aaron Rodgers get to sit some toward the end of games. So there are top quarterbacks who are getting a little time off en route. But I guess the Bucs don't feel that that's the right way to go.
The Cardinals lost at home to Miami, and I thought that was somewhat of a surprise because I didn't think that Miami's offense was going to be quite there to match up with the explosive Cardinals offense. Does that win legitimize the Dolphins as a playoff contender? And what does it say about Arizona not being able to hold off a team going in where you thought they were the better football team?
Well, first thing I'm going to say is I'm going to pat myself on the back because I said last week in the podcast that was the game I was most looking forward to. Rob, that was the best game of the season so far.
It was.
It was up down the field. It was exciting. There was some great plays. Those 2 quarterbacks was so much fun to watch. Kyler Murray might be the most exciting offensive player in the league. As for the Dolphins winning it, the Dolphins have been taking incremental steps ever since the first 2 weeks of the season. They've been one of the better teams in the league since October began. So I'm not surprised they won that game. I do think Arizona is a bit of a better team. But this is one of those games where it was a shootout, and Arizona missed a field goal at the end that could have tied it. I think the Dolphins are legitimate. Do I think they'll win that division? Probably not, but I think they have a shot at the playoffs. And I definitely think Arizona has a shot at the playoffs.
You mentioned the Raiders beating Cleveland. They went on the road and won another game against the Chargers. They're 4-1 outside of Vegas. Are they the real deal?
We'll find out over the next 2 weeks because they have 2 more division games. And the Raiders have really struggled in the division in recent years. They play Denver this week, and then they play Kansas City, who they beat. They only lost for the Chiefs so far. The thing I really like about the Raiders is how they're running the ball and how physical they're playing. The Raiders were not a physical team under Gruden the first couple of years. The only physicality we saw was all the penalties they would get. But this is a different look to this team, and I think Gruden's done a nice job in making a turnaround. Are they a playoff contender? We'll find out after these next 2 weeks, I think.
I want to ask you if you saw the Marcus Peters interception in a Baltimore-Indianapolis game, because I still can't understand how that was a catch. I know there's been some debate over catch, non-catch for years now in the league. That was a pick. What did you think of it?
I thought it was a clear incompletion, and I heard Dean Blandino on SiriusXM the other day explaining why it was called an interception. And apparently, when you look at it in slow motion, as they do on the replay reviews, the letter of the law for interceptions was actually carried out by Peters, and the third step of it was him falling to the ground. But to me, that's ridiculous because he didn't have control of the ball.
Yeah, it's and obviously a lot of criticism for that. That one to me, I knew, when you super slow-mo it, you see him doing that, you see him making those steps necessary, but that was one of those where you go, oh, come on. It's just so obvious. All right, looking at some of the games this weekend, 7-2 Bills visit the 5-3 Cardinals. We just talked about Arizona. They're a slight 2-point favorite. Buffalo's coming off what I thought was a very impressive win against Seattle. This is a tough one to call. I wouldn't play this game if I were a betting man, but how do you see this game?
Very close. The defense of the Cardinals is susceptible against the pass, as we saw last week, as we saw against Seattle. And Buffalo passes the ball pretty well. I still am not sold on Buffalo's defense. I thought it was almost more self-destruction by Seattle in that game last weekend. I see this as a close game. I would not be surprised if either team wins, but I will tell you this, and I'd like to hear what you think on it, Rob. A win like this for Buffalo really would legitimize that team heading toward the playoffs.
Oh, absolutely, because that's at this point what this team needs is a nice win. They get one last week at home against Seattle. You go on a road, you beat a winning team on the road, you prove that maybe you can go into January, and if you get through the first week, you got to go on the road. You could beat good teams. So I think it means a lot for both teams because Arizona is trying to establish themselves at 5-3 as a real contender in the NFC West, and you know how tough that division is. So, yeah, it's a tough one to call. This one, Eagles-Giants, 2 teams, 5 wins combined. You wouldn't think going into Week 10 that a game like that matters much, but in the NFC East, it's first place is almost at stake. Eagles got a game and a half lead, so they're still guaranteed first place, win, lose, or tie at the end of this week, but the Giants can get closer. The Giants very well could be 4-5, Barry, instead of 2-7. If they made a play against the Eagles, whether it was Evan Ingram catching the ball on that third down play or one other play, or if Jones doesn't turn the ball over twice against Tampa, they could have won both of those games. Eagles are 1-3 following a bye under Doug Peterson. They're getting healthier. They've won 8 in a row against the Giants, but we know it's hard to beat the same team twice in a 24-day span. Eagles are a 3-point favorite. I don't feel good about this from a Philadelphia perspective. I don't think it's going to be as easy many people assume it will be. How do you see it?
I think it'll be a similar game to the one we saw in Philadelphia. The Giants have played well the last 3 weeks or so. They're definitely improving as they move along. The Eagles, though, they're just so much more talented than the Giants if they get back some of those players. And it looks like they will have some of those players in the lineup. If the Eagles don't make some of those silly mistakes and don't gamble the way they did the last time they played the Giants or in most of their other games. They played a little more close to the vest. I think I like the Eagles, but I think it's going to be a very close game.
Monday Night Football, Bears are going to try to stop a 3-game losing streak. They're at home against Minnesota. The Vikings are, although they're 3-5, they've won 2 in a row. They've shown signs of life, and they're actually a 2.5-point favorite against a 5-4 team on the road. That tells me to go with the better offense, the better team, Minnesota here. How do you see it?
I have virtually nothing good to say about the Bears right now. I think the Vikings are going to wind up second in that division, and I wouldn't be shocked if they get up to around 500. I don't know if that would get them into the playoffs. I think the Bears are just a plummeting team. They have shown me very little, certainly nothing on offense, and I don't blame Nick Foles. There's just not much around him. That offensive line is terrible. He's only got one true receiver now in Robinson, and even he had a big drop last week. So I like the Vikings in that, and I like the Vikings to win that rather easily, too.
All right, Barry, as always, good stuff. I'll talk to you again next week.
You bet, Rob.
Joining me now, AP Seattle sports writer Tim Booth. Tim, the Seahawks have lost 2 of 3 after a 5-0 start. Russell Wilson's got 7 turnovers in those 2 losses, which is very uncharacteristic of Russ. What's going on there? How much are injuries a factor? And how can this team correct these mistakes?
You know, I think there's a multitude of factors going on. I think number one is at some point Russ is going to have to come back down to earth a little bit. He had played so well, especially over those first 6 games, and had played so clean that I think there was going to be just like a little bit of a natural regression as time went on. And I think that's why the turnover numbers sort of jump out a little bit over the past 2 or 3 weeks. But by the same token, I think whether he wants to admit it or not, he's feeling a little bit of a need to press or some pressure just because of how poorly Seattle continues to play on defense. And I think that's what we saw last week in Buffalo, especially because, you know, before he really had a chance to blink, he was facing a 14-0 deficit. And that was just a matter of Seattle defense being unable to get a stop. And it continues to be a problem. It's been a problem from week 1. It has just been this inability to get off the field, giving up just a sort of an eye-opening amount of passing yards, especially, and putting them in situations where Russ kind of needs to be perfect or close to perfect for them to win some of these games. And I think that really kind of came to the forefront last week in Buffalo. You don't see him make the kind of mistakes that he made in that game unless he feels the need that he has to either force things or he has to make something happen that's not there. I thought the biggest example of that was they had a fourth and goal in the first quarter. They're already down 14-0. Clearly, it was a situation where this was not going to be a day where they were going to be able to get stops on defense. And they not only, instead of kicking the field goal, they went for it, and Russ, forces in a pass, and it gets picked off in the end zone. And there goes, a scoring chance. And then later in the game on a 3rd and 25, rather than just, take a check down throw, it's a 14-point game at that point. He's feeling the need to go get points. He forces in a throw, and that one gets picked off. So I think that's sort of what's led to what you've seen from Russell the last few weeks. Just this sort of overwhelming feeling of, I kind of have to go score every time the ball is in my hands because we can't stop anybody on the defensive side, and we're going to have to figure out a way to win these games 45-42 or 35-31, whatever the total ends up being. It's got to be on me going out and doing that. Injuries certainly are not helping Seattle defensively. They're potentially going into this week against the Rams without both of their starting cornerbacks. But really, whoever Seattle has put out there in the secondary especially, it hasn't worked yet this year. And so whether Quentin Dunbar or Shaquille Griffin end up playing this week in their secondary, it might not matter because there's some clear issues right now that they've got to get figured out on the defensive side.
Well, that defense, I saw a stat that you put out there in one of your stories. Their pass defense is on pace to not just break the record for most yards allowed, but shatter it by 1,000 yards. And this is a secondary that's a long way removed from that Legion of Boom. Part of the issue might be that, well, teams are throwing a lot against them to keep up in these shootouts, but they're giving up a ton of yards, as you said. At this point in the season, and injuries being a factor, is this just who they are and they're going to have to win games as a shootout, or is there something that they can do somehow, some way they can come up with anything on defense to maybe not hold teams to single digits, but under 30 points?
I think there's a couple of things there. They came out of their win over San Francisco 2 weeks ago really optimistic about where they were going defensively, because for 3 quarters, they completely shut down the 49ers. Now, that was a 49ers team that had Jimmy Garoppolo, who was basically unable to move because of his ankle issues, and was on their 4th-string running back and was without a couple of their top receivers. So maybe that's not the best example, but at least that performance gave them some optimism that, hey, maybe we can get this thing figured out. And they were getting Jamal Adams back last week against Buffalo. So the thought was, hey, we're really kind of moving towards what we thought we were going to be at the beginning of the season. The concern is that Buffalo didn't even try to run the ball. Josh Allen just came out and threw it right from the start. And he ended up throwing for 415 yards against them. He's the 3rd quarterback this year to throw for over 400 yards against Seattle. That and a lot of the conversation earlier in the season was, the big numbers that Matt Ryan put up against Seattle, or even Dak Prescott against the Seahawks. Well, those were garbage time yards, or Seattle had a big lead and the teams had to throw the ball in order to come back and beat them. What we saw last week was a team essentially deciding to abandon the run game and not even try to bring that aspect of their offense against Seattle and just say, hey, we think your pass defense is terrible. We're going to try and expose it in every way we can. And yeah, Josh Allen got sacked 7 times, but he also threw 3 touchdowns and threw for 415 yards, and Buffalo ended up winning the game. So there's definitely a major concern that last week was just sort of this eye-opening exposure of, like, it's not the garbage time thing. It's not teams trying to come from behind. It's teams going out there and fundamentally finding problems in your defensive system and exposing them and not even trying to run the ball and have that aspect of the offense working against them. The piece that I think Seattle hopes that they can build going forward is the pass rush. And early in the year, it was all about having to blitz in order to get home and to get pressure on the quarterback, whether that was what we saw with Adams in the first couple of weeks before he got injured, or in recent weeks when they would bring Bobby Wagner or rookie Jordan Brooks, or, whatever combination of linebackers and defensive backs to get extra pressure on the quarterback. What we saw last week against Buffalo, yeah, they did blitz some, but the addition of Carlos Dunlap, who they got in trade from Cincinnati a few weeks ago, sort of changed the dynamic of that front 4. And you saw Dunlap getting pressure on Josh Allen. You saw defensive tackle Jaron Reid, who a couple of years ago had 10.5 sacks. You saw him suddenly reemerge and start to get some pressure on the quarterback. So, and they're hoping of getting Benson Mayowa back, if not for Sunday against the Rams, potentially next Thursday against Arizona. So there's some hope that maybe they finally have found some mix on that defensive line of that front 4 that they can then get pressure with 4 and be able to play 7 behind in coverage and maybe close some of these gaps that have been exposed by the times that they're bringing 5 or 6 to get that quarterback pressure. That's, again, there's still a lot of issues with what's going on with their pass defense, but they feel like maybe if they can get pressure with 4, then some of those holes in the back end might be able to get closed up.
Tim, the next 2 weeks are a very difficult, tough test for the Seahawks, and we'll know if they have a real shot at that number 1 seed or what they're going to be coming out of it, because they're going to face the Rams on the road, and then on Sunday, then a home game on a Thursday night against Arizona. The Rams are kind of a different team this year in that their defense is carrying them more so than their offense. They've been a little bit inconsistent. What do the Seahawks have to do to beat this Rams team on the road?
Block Aaron Donald. That's easier said than done. I think Pete Carroll today called him the best player in the world.
It's pretty accurate.
It is pretty accurate. That guy's been Russell Wilson is going to have nightmares long after his career's done about the times Aaron Donald has jumped on his back. You know what? I think Seattle's just got to go in saying, okay, we kind of have to win, figure out a way to score, 30 points. I mean, that's sort of what the baseline is now for them, at least this year, is we got to get to 30 points and then figure out maybe if we can get a stop here and there defensively to sort of slow down the opponent. How that works, I don't know, because, again, Seattle's got not only Seattle banged up in the secondary, they're still without their top two running backs, Chris Carson and Carlos Hyde, and there's a lot of uncertainty whether either one of them will be back this week. I would say right now it probably looks like neither one of them will be able to play. So then you're relying on a rookie in DJ Dallas and a second-year guy in Travis Homer, who's more of a third down back, and then Alex Collins, who they just recently signed off the street to their practice squad and ended up playing last week. It's not an optimal situation to play in the way that Seattle traditionally has played in the past, which is, control the game with the run and then hit some big plays down the field with the pass. This is a team that's just going to have to throw the ball to have success. And so, maybe DK Metcalf can have a big day. Maybe Tyler Lockett can have a big day. Maybe it depends on if Jalen Ramsey is shadowing one of those two guys for the entire game. It's a really tough circumstance that they're going into this week, especially in such a short period and in having such defining games over these next 5 days essentially. Because coming out of this, Seattle might get a lot healthier, but they're going into a stretch of games that even if they weren't healthy, they would be expected to win, whether it's Philadelphia or the Jets or the Giants or playing Washington. They're going into a stretch coming out of it where they probably should go 4-0 no matter what, which sort of highlights the importance of these two games and how much not being close to 100% could end up hampering them over the next 10 days or whatever it might be. So I don't have a simple answer for how they win this game other than Russell performs some magic and they kind of win a game 38-35. But as you said, this is a Rams team that seems to be better defensively this year, and I don't know if Seattle can put up 30 or 35 points against them.
You said DK Metcalf's name, and that's one that I hear probably every day in Philadelphia because his name will come up every single time J.J. Arcega-Whiteside, who was drafted ahead of him, does nothing, absolutely nothing. And he's at this point, it's safe to say he's been a second-round bust. How grateful is Seattle that every team in the NFL passed on DK? And did you expect him to be this good this soon?
They're extremely grateful. I don't know if it was the concerns about his neck injury, if it was concerns about work ethic, if it was the fact that he played in a fairly simplistic offense at Ole Miss. But I mean, every day they're incredibly thankful for the fact that somehow he slipped down to where they could take him with the last pick of the second round. His development has been. You saw flashes of it last year. I mean, you were there in person seeing him in the wild card game against the Eagles when I think he had 6 catches for 160 yards, which up until a couple weeks ago was the best game of his career. The consistency this year has kind of been the thing. I mean, he's had 90 yards receiving at least in 7 of the 8 games. He's been over 100 yards 4 times. It's just that sort of exponential growth that we saw flashes of as a rookie that's now shown up with the consistency in his second year. The amount of trust that Russell Wilson has in him is just off the charts. And I think a lot of that is due to the fact that in the off season, they made it a priority to figure out, as COVID was going on, how to safely figure out a way to work out together. And it essentially involved DK moving in with Russell at his compound in Southern California, isolating themselves from the rest of the world and working out every day for about a month and learning how to read each other, how to run the routes, how to, little nuances that I think you're seeing show up on the field this year. And then this guy has an insatiable work ethic. He even mentioned it sometime in the last couple of weeks that he's actually grateful that he wasn't a first-round pick, because he wonders if he would have the same kind of chip on his shoulder or the same work ethic if he'd gone in the first round, like everyone was thinking he was going to after that performance he put in at the combine. By slipping to the second round, he kind of feels like it sort of reinvigorated that need to go out and prove everybody wrong again. And right now he's doing it at a level that he's going to be in consideration for all pro at the end of the year if he keeps this up. He's on pace for over 1,500 yards and 16 touchdowns. I mean, it's the kind of year you saw out of Calvin Johnson and Julio Jones when they were in their second and third years. And he's got a kind of a similar, incredibly unique body type and strength.
He's a
and
monster,
speed
man.
Combination. It's incredible. Yeah. And so we might be seeing the emergence of that next guy. Maybe he's not going to be nicknamed Megatron, but of that kind of receiver that just has that ability to use those God-given skills and his own work ethic to go out there and just dominate games the way that, say, Calvin or Julio, when he was in his prime, were able to do.
Tim, last one for you. Seattle gave Pete Carroll a contract extension through the 2025 season. He's 69 years old. He was already signed through 2021. So why do it now and during a pandemic?
That's a good question, actually. Pete's always worked under this 5-year plan idea. Uh-huh. And I think part of what happened was in 2018, he was about to go in. He had kind of done 2010 to 2015, and then 2015 to 2020. That was sort of how everything was sort of laid out. And at the end of the late in the 2018 season, they went ahead and extended him through 21. And I think Pete's just kind of gotten. I think at that time he was trying to see if he could sort of tear down a team that had run its course, the team that had won the Super Bowl and everything and all those personalities that they had. I think he wanted to see if he could actually sort of turn it over and start anew and bring in that next batch of guys and see how they developed and how they molded over the next couple of years. And I think he's kind of seen this upward trend that, in all honesty, probably has gone faster than he even maybe thought. And I think that's what he sees. I think he sees that he has the quarterback, that he has some of those anchor pieces in place, that he's going to have this sort of developmental period. Eventually they're going to cycle through a few more guys, whether it's, Bobby Wagner or KJ Wright or, Dwayne Brown, a handful of other veterans who maybe are getting toward the latter part of their careers, and they're going to have to cycle through again. But I think he's seen that it can work and that they can make it turn over and be successful maybe faster than they thought that it was going to be. And now he's kind of getting into that for these next couple of years, or that window to get back to a Super Bowl and maybe win another title. And then can they sustain that through that 25 season, or do they have to do another sort of pseudo overhaul and try and make themselves into a contender again by the time he's getting toward the end of that contract? And so that's kind of how I think he sees things as he looked at those 5-year windows. Why it happened in the middle of during a pandemic, I don't fully know. I think that was just opportunity and a conversation, and I think there's also been some certainty given by Jody Allen, who took over as the sort of overseeing the franchise after the death of her brother Paul a few years ago. I think there was some uncertainty there, and now that's been settled that she intends to keep the ownership of the team going forward. So I think it just sort of all added up that right now is kind of the right time just to solidify that and say, okay, Pete, here you go. Here's your 5-year runway. Now let's see what we can do over those 5 years and see, maybe it said he's the youngest 69-year-old I know of right now. So maybe he'll still be the youngest 74-year-old in 5 years, and we'll want to keep doing this. He has no signs right now of slowing down or being interested in doing anything else other than coaching the Seahawks.
That's Tim Booth. He does a fantastic job covering the Seahawks. Follow him on Twitter @ByTimBooth. Tim, Look forward to chatting with you in a couple weeks when Seattle takes on Philadelphia.
Sounds good, man. Take care.
Emmanuel Acho is making his most impactful tackle 6 years after playing his last game in the NFL. Emmanuel, who played linebacker for the Cleveland Browns and Philadelphia Eagles, has enjoyed a spectacular rise off the field. It started with his desire to tackle racism. Acho is the host of Fox Sports 1's Speak for Yourself. He celebrated his 30th birthday this week with the official release of his book, Uncomfortable Conversations with a Black Man. His YouTube series with the same name has already amassed over 65 million views in 5 months. Emmanuel was my first guest on the debut of the AP Pro Football Podcast back in September, and we caught up again this week. Emmanuel, we're at the midpoint of the NFL season. Who do you see as a front runner in each conference right now? Obviously, you look at the AFC, Chiefs, Steelers, look at the NFC, and it's up for grabs everywhere. Who do you see as the front runners?
Man, I'm so glad that my answer is about to be what it is, because at the beginning of the season, I put out a tweet, Robert. I said, Saints versus Chiefs in the Super Bowl. And thankfully, I see the Saints as a front runner in the NFC, and in the AFC, I do see Chiefs and Steelers. But if it's a coin flip, give me the Chiefs. Give me the Chiefs over the Steelers as it stands now.
Well, you mentioned the Saints. What was your biggest takeaway of that beatdown they put on Tom Brady and the Buccaneers on Sunday Night Football?
They still got a chokehold over the division. They've won the division 3 straight years. They said, nah, Tampa, we don't care what you do to everybody else. You're not doing it to us. The Buccaneers have outscored their opponents by 93 points. They're 6-1 against everybody else except the Saints. The Saints have outscored the Buccaneers by 46 points. So Tampa can go out and wax everybody else. But what New Orleans said was, when y'all see us, it's going to be a different story.
Can Tampa rebound from this? Do you think Brady gets the troops together? He's still got Antonio Brown just joined the team. They're still working on chemistry. Obviously, defense is got a little ways to go after that performance. But can they get this thing corrected?
They can, and they will. The question just becomes for how long, right? With Tampa, you dominate. You lay an egg against the Bears. You dominate. You lay an egg against the Saints. You laid an egg against the Saints in week 1. So the issue is, if you lay an egg every 3 or 4 games, by the time you get into the playoffs, when is that egg going to come? Because for the Buccaneers, it's not enough to just go to the playoffs. Let's be real. You got the greatest quarterback of all time, Hall of Famer Antonio Brown, Hall of Famer Rob Gronkowski, Hall of Famer and Mike Evans. At least that's what Tom Brady says. It's not enough to just get to the playoffs. They got to make it all the way to the dance.
I covered Andy Reid's entire career in Philly, and the knock against him by the end, Emmanuel, was, well, he can't win the big one, and his offense is too predictable. Last year, he won the big one. And it seems to me now he is more and more creative with his offense. Is that a product of Patrick Mahomes and the talent that he has? Because Donovan McNabb was a pretty talented dude too. Or is that just Andy evolving and adapting and adjusting his style?
As a product of playing with house money. When you go to the casino and you start winning a little bit, the money's not yours anymore. So now if you lose, you're not as concerned with it. Andy Reid has won a Super Bowl. The whole world knows he's a top 2 offensive mind, him and Eric Bieniemy in the game. So when he goes out there and runs ridiculous plays like he ran yesterday, Patrick Mahomes catching the snap while in motion, taking a 360 and throwing a touchdown pass, if it doesn't work, not a big deal. House money. So it's really a product of Patrick Mahomes, but now Andy Reid he's coaching very freely. There is no hot seat for Andy Reid for the next 5 or so years.
The joke of the NFL is obviously the NFC East, and I happen to see what the Eagles look like on a daily basis. They're leading the division at 3-4-1. They're the front runner in what is the worst division in football. And there was talk last week. There were actual questions that I thought were ridiculous and asinine of Doug Peterson to bench Carson Wentz. Where do you stand on that? Because I know, Emmanuel, you're more sensible than a lot of the hot takers out there.
You can't bench Carson Wentz. That's ridiculous. The only reason people are having the conversation is because of Jalen Hurts. But I would submit that Carson Wentz is actually doing more with less than just about any quarterback in the National Football League. Carson Wentz has a practice squad receiver last year. Travis Fulgham, since week 4, leads the NFL in receiving yards. Obviously, the Eagles had a bye week this past week, so maybe some other receivers had overtaken him. Carson Wentz has the most players on IR in the NFL. I think they're a top 3 IR team, without Alshon Jeffrey, without Deshaun Jackson, without Zach Ertz. Dallas Goedert was hurt for the longest. Miles Sanders was hurt. Jalen Reagor was out for forever. And it still somehow has this team at first in the division. He's actually doing a pretty good job given the circumstances. A lot of turnovers, I get it, but he also has 17 touchdowns.
Last time we spoke, it was just around the time where your show, Speak for Yourself, was expanded to a couple hours. It was obviously, we talked about you getting that job 4 years to the day where you first auditioned. Emmanuel, what has the past couple months been like for you with everything that you have going on and doing a daily show like that?
A whirlwind. Keep your priorities in order and prioritize your orders. Like it's chaos between Speak for Yourself, Uncomfortable Conversations with a Black Man, the book, the show, everything going on. It's just a matter of make sure you give your time to what you need to give your time to, Rob. So been crazy, been really good, been very fulfilling, but I am running on fumes very often.
Well, you touch on that book, and I want to get into that. Uncomfortable Conversations with a Black Man. The show is over 65 million views, which is just incredible. It's phenomenal. The book releases this week. You hit so many important topics throughout that book. I want to ask you first about one that I can relate to, and you probably don't even know this about me. You grew up, you said, with an identity complex because your parents are from Nigeria. You're going to a private school, a white school predominantly. Kids are calling you Manny instead of Emmanuel. My real name isn't Rob. It's Rabia, R-A-B-E. It's the Arabic word for spring. I had that same thing growing up, and it shaped kind of my childhood, and it played a big role in many mistakes that I made along the way and who I eventually became. How did that experience maybe shape you early? How did you overcome it? And what would you say to young kids who, like us, may have gone through something like that?
I would tell young kids, one, don't doubt yourself and soak it all up. What do I mean by that? Soak it all up. An identity complex is bad because of the word complex, but it also can be beneficial because of the multifaceted growth that can occur. See, I was Nigerian American, but was immersed in white culture and was immersed in Black culture, which is why now, Rob, I'm being able to have these conversations. See, at the time, I didn't know if I was Black because my white peers would say, Emmanuel, you don't even talk like you're Black. You don't even dress like you're Black. You're like an Oreo, Black on the outside, white on the inside. But now looking back, I'm like, wait, I was able to learn from all of those different environments, and that's actually been a benefit to my life.
In a chapter about reverse racism, you shared a story, your second season in the NFL, your first season with the Eagles, and being bullied by a defensive lineman. Can you share with the listeners, because you really explain and help dismiss that idea of reverse racism.
Yeah, well, first and foremost, reverse racism doesn't exist. Racism can exist, but like reverse racism is a man-made concept of nothingness. I tell the story of my second year in Philly. There's a defensive lineman. He just didn't like me for whatever reason. Totally different. I don't really go out. He's a go out kind of guy. I'm a little more reserved. He's a little more loud, whatever the case may be. And finally, after practice one day, I say to him, "You're the worst teammate in the history of teammates." And I said, imagine how silly it would sound if someone said, Emmanuel, you were being a reverse bully. No, I was just simply standing up for myself. Let us not mistake people, Black people, brown people, standing up for themselves against the likes of oppression and systemic injustice and racism. Let us not mistake that for reverse racism. Now, if Black people are going to be prejudiced against white people, call that racism. But reverse racism makes no sense.
What would you like to be the biggest takeaway? I mean, obviously there's so much information in this book, and you go and explain so many different topics and dive into it and tackle it. And you do make it uncomfortable, because I'll tell you what, as I'm reading in the introduction, I grew up watching Dukes of Hazzard. It never occurred to me, Emmanuel. It never occurred to me. And I take a step back and I go, wow, how about that? That is uncomfortable, right? What is the biggest takeaway you hope people will get out of this?
I hope very simply that people realize they actually have the ability, and it is up to them to change the world. At a minimum, change their world. See, Rob, if you can change your household, you can affect that city because your house, it exists in that city. And that city can have a domino effect on the state, which resides within the nation, and the nation ultimately the world. But we have to each make independent decisions to affect our world, our individual world. When I was a kid, I used to play with dominoes. And I would line about 50 dominoes up. I'd push the first one down and watch them all start to domino down, tumble down. See, but Rob, I never thought, at least imagine, the first domino never thought that it would knock down the 50th. The first domino's objective was to knock down the domino closest to it. And my goal for this book, you don't need to knock down, change the mind of the person in a neighboring state. Change the mind of your neighbor. Change the mind of the person in the neighboring bedroom. Let's do that, and let's see the ripple effect.
I want to ask you again, because I know last time we spoke about your conversation with Roger Goodell. Have you had an opportunity maybe to follow up with him? Do you stay in touch? And what are your thoughts on what the NFL has done? We're now midway through the season, what they've been doing, the social justice initiatives, and how far do we have to go?
Yeah, I stay in touch with him and his team. They'll reach out at random and vice versa. And sometimes I'll just send them positive notes, or they'll send me positive notes when they're doing something committed to the efforts of justice. Again, I don't think racial reconciliation is a finish line we'll cross. I think it's a road that we'll travel. And I'm just glad that the NFL is now choosing to travel that road. Some people may condemn the NFL for the pace in which they're traveling on the road, but I am glad that we're choosing to travel that road, because unlike a football game, Rob, we won't be able to look up and say, touchdown, we scored against racism. But what we do have to say is, okay, we're marching down the field. Let's all just march down the field towards reconciliation together.
Well, the book is out. It's available. I hope everyone gets their hands on a copy. I know you have something coming up with Oprah too as well, correct?
Yes, Oprah and I have a conversation. We're having one live Wednesday, November 11th. So you can go to my bio on Instagram, my bio on Twitter, uncomfortableconvos.com/book, BOOK, and you can register for that event as well.
Awesome. Emmanuel, as always, man, thank you, brother.
Yes, sir. Pleasure's mine.
Time for some final thoughts. I had an off-the-record conversation with an NFL coach late last regular season, and we were talking about Lamar Jackson, who was having a phenomenal year, and he eventually went on to win the NFL MVP award. This coach told me he believed that defenses would eventually figure Jackson out, and the quarterback had to improve his passing, his mechanics, his ability to dissect defenses in order for the Ravens to have success in the postseason. And we know they went on and lost in the playoffs in their first game last year. So it's interesting to hear Jackson say this week that he sees some defenses calling out Baltimore's plays, and sometimes they know what's coming. Obviously, that's probably contributed to some of his struggles this season. After throwing for 36 TDs and only 6 interceptions last year, Jackson is on pace for 24 touchdowns and 8 picks. Those are decent numbers, but down from his MVP year. Seems that coach may have been right, and defenses have figured him out just a little bit. Time for Lamar Jackson and Baltimore's offense to make some adjustments. That's it for this week's AP Pro Football Podcast. Thank you to Emmanuel Acho, Barry Wilner, and Tim Booth. Please subscribe to the show on iTunes and wherever you get your podcasts. Share and leave a review. And also check out our college football writer, Ralph Russo, and his AP Top 25 College Football Podcast. Until next week, I'm Rob Maaddi, reminding you, make a difference. Be a blessing.